Westchester needs to let the world know, wait a minute, we are here. We're not from the last century. We're a good city for this, a good location for this century. It's a very competitive business. Westchester has a lot going for it, but it's time to be into the market. There's two primary challenges with Westchester. There are fundamental real estate and structural challenges that we talked about that are going to take time for the market to pick up. The government can try and do some things to incent that behavior. The selection of office choices was fairly limited and, quite frankly, fairly aging. There's another issue that's a little softer, and I think that's Westchester's image. You have a situation where your inventory of buildings is old, your demographics are a little old, and your image is old. It's not on people's radar screen right now as a place to go in the 2010s. You're looking for that niche of a headquarters operation that wants to be able to access people in the city, but for whatever reason, maybe executive preference, would rather not live in the city. There's no silver bullet. It takes informed and aligned leadership. It takes a supported vision, and it takes both short-term and long-term commitment. There has to be a little bit of patience. You can't make this change overnight. There's a strong communication demand too. And that takes message, and that message has to be clear, concise, consistent, and presented over a fairly sustained period of time.
At the Partnership for New York City, what we did in the mid-90s when we saw a real problem in terms of the future of our economy was we organized an investment fund so we could put our money where our mouth is, and we essentially put up private sector capital in the areas that we thought were important for the city to focus on, and that really worked in getting the government agencies to join with the private sector on an agenda for growth. Mayor Bloomberg was elected in 2001, took office in 2002. That was shortly after the dot-com bust, and New York City, Silicon Alley was sort of a joke in the technology community. And within just over a decade, 11 and a half years, we've gone from being kind of a technology laughingstock to being the country's second most important innovation technology hub after Silicon Valley. And we're on our way to becoming number one because we are, in fact, the center of the next generation of applied technology in finance, in healthcare, in retail, and in all these sectors. Our partnership was started by David Rockefeller at the beginning of the 1980s. But in looking over your blueprint and looking at some of the other materials on Westchester, I see today that while this is an extremely strong community, you have a lot of challenges, as we do in New York. Most importantly, we're both very much part of a metropolitan region that is enormous in terms of its economic importance in both a national and global sense. We have a $1.3 trillion regional economy, so we are a serious economic player in truly a global sense. David Rockefeller had a view of public-private partnerships. Public-private partnership is not business taking over the responsibilities of government. It is truly a new structure where business, government, and the non-governmental sector work together on a shared agenda and not a devolution of government responsibilities. He also taught that these partnerships have to engage the private sector partners at the beginning. It doesn't work if government comes to the private sector with a fully baked plan and is simply looking to government again, or to the business community to pay for it. What's really important is that government have a clear understanding of the agenda, bring the data, bring the issues to the table, but that everybody sits down together at the beginning to help in the design and construction of a project. And I think that's one of the things that is often the mistake that is made and why we don't have more effective structures. For the foreseeable future, in the future, the economic drivers of this country are going to be our metropolitan regions. And that's going to devolve a lot of responsibility on these regions. And what he said is what's really important is that these regions not simply think that their local government, their county, or their mayor has to address these problems, rise to the occasion, find the resources, because that's impossible. And he said that it's the real collaborations between government, business, labor, universities, investors, that has to come together, and we have to find those structures. Government very often can't make pioneering investments. The budget process, the restrictions, the procurement process, many of the issues that government faces, it can't get out of its own way. One of your hometown companies, IBM, has really pioneered this 9-to-14 model with PTEX, which is a great public-private partnership that President Obama acknowledged in his State of the Union address this year. Our partnership initiatives in New York City, we worked with Mayors Koch, Dinkins, Giuliani. Under Mayor Bloomberg, they took on a new cast, as you can probably guess. Mayor Bloomberg is the first businessman mayor of New York City in more than a century. His natural affinity and understanding for what business cares about, what they need to do, his ability to pull people to run his government or manage his agencies, as well as ideas out of the private sector, since he had a global reach in terms of the business community and the philanthropic community. But we did a kind of blueprint for the next mayor. The whole business community is in separation anxiety at the moment. And that blueprint for the next mayor kind of lays out sort of what were the key principles, the key things Bloomberg did, and how that should be a opportunity for the next mayor to kind of take those same pieces. The first thing that we note is that Bloomberg came into office with a highly focused, big vision. So Bloomberg really understood that the growth in the global economy was going to come out of technology-enabled sectors, whether it was digital media or health or advanced manufacturing, that New York City had to position itself at the forefront of that economy. And that was going to require a big change that ran across business, a change in our legacy industries, as well as big changes in our universities and how we were educating our kids, and really worked to get everybody on board around that vision from day one that he was in. It wasn't just the economic development people that he was talking to, but every agency of city government and as many of the 300,000 employees of city government as he could reach and influence. Part of their mission became New York as a center of innovation and the rebranding of New York City as a technology hub. And in fact, today, we are second only to Silicon Valley, having eclipsed Boston in that regard. We've got more startups than any place out of Silicon Valley in the digital tech sector. Biggest growth in venture capital investment. The biggest issue, the biggest challenge still is that we don't have enough engineering talent, and that might be an issue that we share and can discuss with you in terms of producing it. But again, the mayor turned to public-private partnerships to beef that up. Worked with the private sector after business identified the biggest reason for not growing technology-related activity in New York City was the lack of qualified tech people, both from PhD engineers down to the kind of computer savvy workers that came out of the community colleges in California. We were in deficit on the entire array, and instituted what many feel is going to, in the long run, be his most important legacy, which is the Applied Sciences Initiative, where Cornell and the Technion of Israel are developing a huge campus on Roosevelt Island that's going to double the number of PhD engineers that we have in New York City within a decade. And similarly with NYU and Columbia, big expansions in their engineering programs, new center for NYU Polytech with applied urban sciences, which is a huge growth area in industry and around the world, and big data initiative with Columbia. So that, again, is a major public-private partnership initiative that is part of taking our economy into the new economy. Bloomberg also understood that the most important role that business sees in terms of the government is to create a great environment for attracting talent. As a result, he set out to think about how to make New York City really attractive to a new generation of entrepreneurs and the world's great innovators. And some of the things that came out of that is the effort to become the greenest city in America in terms of amending our building code laws and passing sustainability initiatives and reducing our carbon footprint. The other thing that was a major initiative on the mayor's part was, again, encouraging diversity, not just sector diversity by developing these new tech clusters, but also geographic diversity. It might surprise you to know that the biggest growth in our GDP, in contribution to our GDP, has come not from Manhattan. It has come from Brooklyn and Queens, which went from 18% to 29% of our city GDP over the last decade. They were bedroom communities to Manhattan up through the 1990s. So this is a major shift. During the Bloomberg administration, 36% of the city's land area has been rezoned. Much of it waterfront development areas, and they've been rebuilt with residential, with the Hudson River Park, the Brooklyn Bridge Park. You've had a whole generation of activity opening up the waterfronts of the city, which has again been really important to attracting young people and to making way for an increased new population. All these initiatives have been accomplished through public-private partnerships. As a result, today New York City is the largest city economy in the world. We've been growing at 3% a year, which is well better than the country. Clearly, we have an intense regional interest in the healthcare industry and in the related industry of biotech, biomedical. Some of the developments over the last more than a decade, I guess, in Westchester have allowed companies that were incubated in New York City, like Regeneron, to be able to grow in the region and contribute and continue to contribute here. We think much more of that can be done. We do not have the ability to house that commercial lab space and the development of those companies in New York City on an economic basis. We can't be competitive. It is my sense that Westchester and parts of Westchester certainly could be far more competitive for that, and I think it's something that we ought to think about together. A second area that we found as we looked at what's going on in New York City, we've lost 100,000 mid-level jobs, and due to competitive pressures and compliance pressures, since a lot of those jobs are corporate and financial industry, we're going to lose more of those jobs going forward. And Westchester has the ability to provide a competitive real estate situation and the talent pool necessary to keep mid-level jobs in the region instead of us ceding them to Governor Perry and others around the country. It would be great to collaborate on some of that effort. I think there's an opportunity here in terms of scaling up of tech companies with the inventory of space that Westchester has. Finally, I think we have enormous shared interests in Washington and in Albany. We do collaborate. We are involved with the regional economic development councils that Governor Cuomo set up, and we get extra points on all our grants if there is collaboration between two regions. New York City is one region, Westchester is another of the 10, there are 10 regions. So there's much more, I think, that we can do in terms of that kind of collaboration. And part of the Regional Economic Development Council's mandate is to work on mandate relief and regulatory relief and legislation that promotes job growth. In addition, there is a tax commission that the governor has appointed that is moving fast to issue a report in the early fall. That tax commission has been charged with looking at corporate and personal tax policies, as with sales tax policies, the whole gamut, not property taxes, to recommend simplification, supposedly revenue neutral, but simplification. It is critically important. Downstate counties, the city, Long Island, and Westchester, send $14 billion more to Albany every year than we get back in services or support programs. We are 87% of the state's high earners, our counties, which means that we're the ones paying the millionaire's tax. Almost nobody else in New York State pays it. For that, we ought to have a voice in how we fix our tax code so it is broader based, so it is simpler, so it is fair, And so it is more competitive with the states that are going after our jobs. That is something where we really have to work together because we've got a short window of opportunity in the near term. As to what I think the biggest challenge Westchester faces, as I look at the multiple units of government at many different levels and with many different functions in Westchester, I do not envy you. And so I think that the biggest challenge Westchester has is to figure out how to create a structure that is user-friendly for business, for university, for the private sector to collaborate with in creating these public-private partnerships. So there's a single decision maker, and you know when you've got that decision, they're going to stick with it.
At the panel discussion on public-private partnerships, which we call P3 for short, we had a very interesting discussion from three different perspectives. The first perspective was given by Stephen Elliott, who was an official at Comptroller DiNapoli's office, who talked about the regulatory background. Dan Marsh, who is from the National Development Council, he talked about the nuts and bolts of how you create these partnerships, the financing mechanisms, and some of the technical terms that are used and technical concepts that are used in these partnerships. Dan Sugarman from United Water told us about a very successful P3 venture in Hoboken between the Municipal Water Authority and United Water. P3s are the wave of the future. Government franchises, government opportunities with private financing and, in the future, private operation of infrastructure projects. Presently, P3s can do design, build, not design, build, operate. If you look at the Hoboken project, the Municipal Water Authority, that was a design, build, operate project. It provided a steady cash flow and predictable costs over a long period of time, which was very good for ratepayers. And it also took public debt off the books of the municipality, improving the bond ratings. The key to P3s is you need either Westchester County for itself or sponsoring some sort of local development corporations to create these opportunities to get control over the asset. In any development, the most important thing is site control. In Westchester, we have a lot of jurisdictions, a lot of towns, a lot of cities. And if you do a significant infrastructure development, it could involve more than one town, more than a town and a city, so on and so forth. What you need to do is relieve the town and the city of the financial burden of funding the infrastructure, because the way they fund it is they have to borrow. They have to issue bonds and they have to borrow. And who pays for the borrowing? The taxpayers. Here, what you have is a developer and a financial services firm combining joint venture, site control by the government, and what the joint venture does, it sells tax-exempt bonds. The cost is paying back the bonds from the revenues of the project. That's the key to it. If you identify what the infrastructure needs of the county are, I'm talking about important infrastructure reforms, waters, sewers to the extent that you have them, power, digital connections. It's very daunting, all these jurisdictions, each one has to decide what they're going to contribute, and are they going to raise taxes, and are they going to borrow, and who's going to borrow. The public-private partnership, particularly if either the county or there is legislation creating a super local development corporation that controls the site of the infrastructure, can make it possible for the private sector on a for-profit basis to build these infrastructure repairs without having to have each one of the municipalities and towns borrow the money. Everything would be repaid by the users. P3s are a device. They are a method of doing economic development. It is an underdeveloped tool in New York State. We need legislation for that, and that's something to work for. There are several things that the blueprint can do, some of which it's doing already, and some of which it could do. It could add to its legislative agenda amendments to the state finance law that would make it possible to expand the use of P3s, because the state finance law limits what public debt can be used for and limits the ability to do P3s. The second thing I think you're already doing, which is to try to relieve some of the regulatory burden. Time is money in development. The third thing is to try to get the state and the county to have like a regional emphasis on development of infrastructure. There has to be some political will. A developer wants one-stop shopping. A developer doesn't want to have to get permission from jurisdiction A and then go to jurisdiction B and then agency C and then agency E. It drives everybody crazy. They need leadership, regional leadership, county leadership, regional leadership, state leadership. Benefits for each one of these jurisdictions is going to outweigh the loss of 100% control over their development. Right now, in any kind of public project, the developer is required to have 4 separate general contractors, and that's the Wicks law. Instead of having one contractor and subcontractors, it's 4 separate contractors. There's duplication, they work seriatim instead of working together. Everybody who is in development understands that it is the most inefficient way of doing any kind of development. Folding it into public-private partnerships is one of the things that could be done perhaps to make them more effective. One of the things that Steve Elliott talked about is there has to be expertise in, because designing public-private partnerships, as I said before, you have to understand the risks. You're planning a project years out. There are all sorts of contingencies that you have to plan for. You know the government is going to be there, but is the private partner going to be there in 15 years? The P3 project for United Water and the Hoboken Municipal Water Authority was one of the most successful P3 projects. In that project, you had an old, falling apart water system, needed lots of capital improvement. There was lots of debt on the books of the municipality, and the assets weren't worth. If you sold the asset, it wouldn't have paid off the debt. United Water came there and said, okay, we will pay your debt. We will fix up, rehabilitate the plant, and then we will operate it. We will bring people in. We are going to have a negotiated rate on a going forward basis, and that rate is going to be how we're going to get repaid. And yes, the water rates are going to go up, but it's not going to go up catastrophically and unpredictably. The Municipal Water Authority continued to own the project. That was the key to it. United Water and the joint venture financed it, they built it, they operated it, but it was still owned by the Municipal Water Authority. In order to obtain the full use of public-private partnerships in our region, what the blueprint has to do is identify the type of projects that we need, identify how they would be possible with a fully developed public-private partnership, and then go to Albany and say, here we have it. We have the opportunity, we have the resources, we have everything except the regulatory authority. Talk about eventually the increased revenues for the state, the increased revenues for the region, because increased revenues for the region means more services for the people. It's very important when we talk about development to understand in politics, you're talking about jobs, revenues, quality of life, services, safety net. My takeaway from the conference was that there are a lot of deep thinkers involved in the blueprint and rethinking Westchester. I was very, very impressed to see this level of thought, this level of commitment coming from Westchester.
Mobile technology, generally referring to commercial wireless networks. Some communities still look at this in maybe an antiquated point of view, that this is somehow a convenience to the public at large. The reality at both a federal level and a state level is that this is a necessity. Over 35% of American households are wireless only. That means they cut the cord. The data that's being run through wireless networks is explosive in terms of the overall usage profile. About 70% of all E911 calls in this country and in New York on a daily basis are made using a wireless network. Those numbers are 100% growth curve per year. And when you look at that over a progression, over the next couple of years and going out a decade, the numbers are staggering, and these networks really, as built today, aren't going to be able to handle that kind of demand. Where we see some concern is that over the next 3 to 5 years, that demand curve, which is on an exponential growth, if we don't keep up on infrastructure development, it'll actually cross what's available. And the reality is that in order to service the public, transmitting antennas have to be close to where people live, work, and play. That's the simple reality. And in order to do that, there's a lot of additional infrastructure that has to be built out. What's happening in many of the metropolitan areas, and in particular Westchester, you're going to start to see over time in-building wireless networks be built out. They'll service not just Wi-Fi, they'll service all the commercial wireless carriers and even public safety. In more of an urban setting like downtown White Plains or Yonkers or Mount Vernon, distributed antenna systems where you're placing antennas on pole tops or lights within the municipal right-of-way along streets. Another small cell technology in some of these enterprise situations, hospitals, college campuses. Then overall, there still needs to be a basic, robust wireless network that depends on what are called macro cells. So for example, rooftop antenna sites, antennas on water tanks, and yes, cell towers. Westchester benefits from being in the greater metropolitan area, so one of the things that means is that from the private sector, capital does flow here in order to try to remedy some of these infrastructure issues that exist. One of the things that municipalities that have better and more robust wireless networks have been able to do is invite carriers into the table, ask them questions about where they're likely to have to site, and then try to find the right locations. Westchester could do better when it comes to overall reliability and redundancy with respect to those types of access to communications or power sources. Westchester's going to have to make sure that it looks at wireless infrastructure, electric infrastructure, backhaul, all these types of technologies in combination to make sure that it's well positioned in order to be able to provide basic services and enhance services to businesses and consumers. The carriers are looking to deploy now additional infrastructure, so the private capital exists, and it's really a question of partnering and working with this industry in order to be able to develop and enhance what exists already today in a community and build it out in a way that meets the community's needs. Westchester should be rethinking what it means in wireless infrastructure generally as far as the ability to provide services. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about enabling services to businesses and consumers. The overall world we're living in is going mobile. And we've talked about cloud computing and different business efficiencies. That's the model that is being developed and persists around the world. If Westchester wants to partake in actually being part of a global economy and intellectual capital of Westchester County and the state of New York, it's going to have the infrastructure that actually enables those services. There's a couple of things I think both the county and municipal officials can do. Inventory their own properties, inventory their own communication networks, and determine where they actually have existing infrastructure and where they don't. We've lived in an environment somewhat in Westchester where it's been a regulatory one, and that dynamic has actually got to change. Let's invite the industry in, let's sit down at the table, figure out where they're going to need to be, figure out where wireless carriers need to develop, where public safety needs to develop, and then let's find out what assets and resources exist in the county and at a local level. And one of the things that is often overlooked is county and municipal property itself. Most of the projects that we see developed are dependent on the private sector and actually have no cost whatsoever to the municipality. So really it's just a question of getting elected officials and appointed officials in the room to be able to plan for and then deploy that private sector capital, which really has a no downside cost to the community.
We can use placemaking to really create the kind of places where young people want to be. Well, everybody wants to be. Young people now, as you know, are flocking to urban areas where there's a quality of life that you can't always find in the suburbs. It's not just about finding jobs. It's not just about finding reasonable, affordable places to live. It's also about the opportunities to meet other young people. It's also a sustainable lifestyle that involves walking and biking and being able to take public transportation. It's nightlife, and it particularly is street life. And when you just look at Brooklyn, I mean, there's a sense of identity to all those neighborhoods. It's really created by the life on the streets. We need to figure out how to bring that kind of placemaking, that kind of activity, street activity, public space activity, to our towns, villages, cities in Westchester County. How can the business community create placemaking opportunities and attract young people in the places where they work? Our office spaces are kind of isolated now. Frequently, we've used single-use zoning for years to kind of isolate residential uses, retail uses, commercial uses, industrial uses, and this creates these kind of barriers. What we need to do is break down those barriers so that we create more mixed-use environments with multiple destinations, with a variety of things to do. Business can work to make that downtown more vibrant, create more street life, create lively plazas, and attract other businesses and opportunities for residential uses around the office buildings. People are not just working there, people are not just driving, parking, and working, but they can actually have the potential of living there, having a place to eat for lunch, having a place to go after work, public spaces to walk around in. You have to find a way to bring a variety of people downtown for a variety of reasons and get them used to being there. But I think the most important thing is that they have to realize that downtown is the place where they can meet their friends and neighbors, have spontaneous interaction, and have really an authentic sense of community. So what's the next step for Westchester County? And that means municipal officials, businesses, and the county working together to really look at placemaking opportunities around the county.